The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are merely an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibility for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast which aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community.
Content warning. This podcast may contain frank and graphic descriptions of sexual abuse and assault, including instances of rape. These accounts can be triggering, specifically for those who have also experienced trauma, especially of a sexual nature.
If at any point during this podcast you feel yourself getting triggered, we suggest taking a break and taking care of yourself before continuing. But we do ask that you continue. These conversations are mentally taxing, but they are so important to have. Thank you. Welcome to episode 8 of the Enough podcast. Today we have my friend and PR guru, Tim, on the podcast as our guest. Tim, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Tim Anderl. I have always had an affinity for music from an early age. And when I was deciding what career to pursue, there were so many music magazines that I loved and spent hours devouring when I was growing up that I decided that I would pursue an education in magazine journalism. I went and got a degree in magazine journalism with the hopes that someday I could write about all of the bands and musicians that I really cared about and really made my soul sing. Went to school for 4 years, found a job in my career field when I left the university, and quickly began to understand that if I was going to write about music, that I needed to be very proactive in seeking out those opportunities for myself. So this was the tail end of the 90s, and it seemed like the natural thing to do was to start a zine to get my feet wet. So I did that. And that quickly pivoted with sort of emergence of the online magazine into moving my zine online. For many years, I had an online magazine called betterrecognize.com. I took a quick pause from that and did some work for Strength Skateboarding magazine and sort of regrouped and started another online blog called uindie.com and did that for many years, and then was doing some freelancing as well at the time with Ghetto Blaster magazine, which was a print magazine for many years and has an online presence, and then found an opportunity 5 or 6 years ago to do some writing and editing for New Noise magazine. And then I've also written for the Alt Weekly that's here in Dayton, Ohio, where I'm based for some years. I did a podcast for a little bit that was music centric, interview style podcast. Then for the last few years, I've maintained those sort of contributing writer relationships with New Noise magazine and Ghetto Blaster magazine primarily, and that's where I continue to write today.
Wow, you've done literally everything under the sun when it comes to music. I mean, the fact that you're not completely burnt out is, just...
I'm in my mid-40s, and some years ago, I started seeing a therapist and started to realize that some mental health things that I was dealing with really determined how active I was in these sorts of pursuits. The need to constantly have that sort of validation. So,
ouch.
Right.
Ouch. I feel that.
I'm feeling very seen.
Right. So for many years, I spent all my free time interviewing bands, doing features on bands, so much so that I was doing sometimes 500 features a year. to include song premieres, video premieres, interviews, short features with bands, and then hundreds of news items a year on top of that, which can be taxing on everything else in your life. But it was part of my own personality that drove me to do those things.
And I think it needs to be stated for people who may not have entered the path that you and I have gone through, because we have similar but different paths here. And when you're doing these things, it's always very exciting. You're doing social networking, you're connecting with people, you're helping out bands, which I think is a huge thing, especially in a smaller scene. You're like, well, whatever I can do to help these small guys get big, because they deserve it. And you want to help, and you want to be there for them, and you want to make those posts, and you want to do the interviews, and you want to do the reviews. This never ends.
Right. Well, and if you don't spend a day doing it when you're in this cycle for as long as you or I have been in it, you're 1,500, 2,000 email pitches behind, you start to feel kind of guilty. Like, why haven't I skipped dinner to make sure that I've gone through these 1,500 pitches to make sure that this really important story that needs to be told is told. You just want to carry that torch in the right way. And especially when you're dealing with so many working class bands, like you have in the punk scene. I have a day job that I go to, and then this is what I do for fun. And so many of the bands that I've interviewed, like, are not bands that are doing this full-time professionally. Like, they are working day jobs, and then they're weekend warriors, or they are teachers so they can tour in the summers, or whatever their particular circumstances are. So you feel like you want to give those people the same access to that platform that larger bands with more of the machine, kind of the corporate machine working behind them, access to the same kind of audiences, right?
So you started out doing a lot more kind of one-on-one writing involvement, doing things to help support bands, and then you ended up moving into the PR side of things. What was the catalyst that got you to really move from forward-facing promotion to more of the back end, behind the scenes kind of promotional work?
Yeah, I mean, I've ended up in the situation before where I've either been assigned things or pitched things that were smaller feature articles, 800 to 1,200 words. And when I pitch or am assigned those things, I know they're going to take somewhere between 10 or 20 hours. That's an investment of my time, in particular, because it's not my full-time day job, right? So I'm spending a lot of my own free time and time in the evenings doing these things. And then to put 20 hours into an 800 or 1,200 word article for a band that ends up being called out as predatory or having done some sort of an atrocious thing, as had happened, and that time you spent, you just feel like is lost in that entire experience, and that sense of pride that comes with that. And then too, you're like, how many people read this and bought their albums as a result, or listened to their music, or became fans of them as a result of the way that I portrayed them. And then that feels really icky too, right? And then if you're doing a cover story, it's a completely different situation. I had one cover story that I was working on when a member of that band was accused of some things, where the magazine that I was working for was not a monthly. So their magazine was going to be on the stand for 3 or 4 months with this band on the cover. And while I'm in the midst of trying to meet the deadline for this, one of the primaries from the band is called out. So now I have to pivot, capture the sort of emerging story from this, and try and do it justice in a way that doesn't cause more harm than good, I guess, right? So just being in situation after situation like that, where I was just spending a good part of my life investing myself in these things, like, it just quit making sense for me to do that. So I started very locally, working with some bands that I'd known for 10, 20 years, had been in the bars with them, had seen how they'd interacted with their fans, knew there was very little risk to supporting those people because I knew ethically and morally the kind of people that they were. Not to say that I've never been fooled.
Right. I think we all have, unfortunately, at this point.
Yeah. If there's one thing that predators are good at, it's
masking their intentions and real personality.
Yeah, exactly. Getting people on their side. Yeah.
Well, sure. And, truth be told, I've championed bands that I knew personally and have used the platforms that were available to me to elevate them and give them a voice in those platforms, and then have found out later that they weren't people that I could trust. I've been burned a few times in those instances, but I feel like the likelihood of that happening with the people that I've chose to represent doing PR is less likely. So this is going to make me really unpopular with other people who are working publicity, but I've chose not to monetize my activity. So what I've done instead is I've asked for a commitment to community action or charitable giving from the folks that I do PR for. So that gives them an opportunity to figure out how they are going to have a positive impact in either in their local community or how they're going to support something that they really care about, either with their time, with their talents, or with a monetary contribution. And so sometimes they leave it up to me, who should we make a donation to? Who should we spend a little time supporting? And other times they already know the things that they are really passionate about and care about. I feel less bad about challenging the traditional system of being paid for that, because I feel like I am being paid for the effort that I'm putting in. Because there's community action that's happening as a result. There's charitable contribution that's happening as a result. And I'm privileged to know that I don't need that additional income stream. The one thing that I will do that is very self-serving is I do ask the artists that I work with to send me a copy of the record. On occasion, I ask them, if
like standard,
right? If it doesn't feel weird, sign it so I could show my kids someday that I was cool once upon a time. And have been really lucky that the folks that I've worked with have been supportive of this model. So
because you've been doing this for so long, like you said, you started, the late 90s, there was sort of this second punk rock explosion with Blink-182 and the mall punk bands. During that time, it seemed like people saw punk rock as a way to get famous, and they could have just as easily been in a metal band or a country band if that was what was popular. But with that comes in these people who don't know about how we treat people in the scene, and that's where a lot of people getting taken advantage of and predatory behavior sort of comes in. And I think it's interesting that shift during the sort of early to mid 2000s.
I was fortunate enough to be introduced to the punk rock scene in the early 90s. Had older people in the scene who took me under their wing and introduced me to things. And I think that's sort of the story for a lot of people, as somebody says, you should listen to this because it's right. Because it's really great. And one of the things that was really special about my own personal experience was that being in sort of the Rust Belt, middle America, to have so many people opening their homes for shows, really doing this grassroots organizing. 40 minutes down the road is Antioch University, which is very progressive university. I won't go into the politics of that, but the umbrella of what Enough is doing, I think they did some really interesting things with regards to consent in the 90s. And I'd hope that anybody who's really looking into this, the the discussion of consent would go back and kind of look at what Antioch was doing in the 90s, where they were saying, let's make this part of the lexicon of exchange and experience when you are deciding whether or not you're going to have a sexual or physical relationship with somebody. They were one of the first universities that made a really hard line on saying, if you're going to touch somebody, if you're going to kiss somebody, if you're going to unbutton their shirt, you need to ask for permission for all of those things, right? Those were some of the lenses that I was looking through the world through as I came up through punk rock. One of my earliest experiences with really hearing people get challenged for their behavior towards other people in the scene, I went to the More Than Music Fest in, I believe it was 1997, and they actually, there were individuals in the crowd that actually challenged the performers that were performing at this weekend-long festival and said, hey, we believe that there's been abusive behavior by members of your bands, and we want to sit down and talk about why that's not okay right now. And they shut down the festival. So, and if you think it was, little Ohio bands that were involved in this, it wasn't. The More Than Music Festival that year had the Promise Ring, they had Boy Sets Fire, they had the Get Up Kids, they had Braid, Code 13. They had a wildly well-known lineup that year. And the festival was shut down to have this discourse. And I felt like that was the first time that I realized like how important it was not only to be a fan of music, but to hold people accountable for how they were treating people within this punk rock scene or ecosystem that you were a part of. So, all of those things have sort of built my ladder of inference with regards to how I choose to do what I do in support of, writing about music, caring about bands, supporting bands with my personal income and time and attention. I don't want to ignore a band that's been challenged by somebody that's been victimized, and I don't want to continue to support that.
I think that's a really good clarification to make. If I choose not to spend my money on someone who is problematic, that's my choice. Like, that doesn't mean I'm quote unquote canceling someone. I'm just choosing not to use my money, my energy to support them. And that's an individual choice that everybody makes.
Now, I've gotten challenged a lot as of late because I've made some opinions about a very famous local comedian from Yellow Springs in particular, who has said some problematic things with his very, very large platform. And I've chose not to champion or support that person. I've chose not personally to spend my time on that person because I don't believe the things that they're saying reflect my values with regards to the communities that my friends occupy. So LGBTQ folks in particular. And it's an unpopular opinion to have locally because this person has done really good positive things in the community with regards to some challenges that the community has had. It's less important for me to know every bad thing that they've said so that I can challenge it than just to not deal with that person until I have some sort of confidence that what they're producing is not something that is victimizing a group of people that my friends belong to. And I feel that same way about music. People are like, well, how do you separate the artist from their art? And then they make, sort of these very compelling arguments like, well, John Lennon did this or David Bowie did that, kinds of things. And it's like, yeah, how do we deal with that as fans of music? That's part of this discussion that you guys are having that I think is so important, which is just at this point for me personally, I feel like it's do more good than harm, you know. And if I feel like I'm doing more good than harm, then, you know, significantly enough more good than harm, right? Not like, okay, I did this one good thing, so I'm gonna go out and support all these people that I know who have been accused of these atrocious things. But I might not cringe when I hear David Bowie in Five Guys burger joint that the same way I would somebody from the punk scene that I know has done some kind of an atrocious act or behavior to somebody either that I know personally or somebody that I know secondhand. The punk scene is so small.
We talked about this before. You know, you kind of keep your house in order to hopefully have, you know, that expand exponentially, you know, across the whole. You want to make sure that, you know, your scene is as clean as it can possibly be, because what it's always been, what I've always seen it be, and what I've been told since before my time, it's always been, is that the punk scene is always supposed to be ahead. It's more open. It's a place where everyone else was supposed to go that didn't fit anywhere else. And now we're inside that position fighting with each other that's here. Like, that doesn't really make sense to me. And why would we support people that are, you know, breeding this internal fighting or internal hurt or abuse? We're supposed to be us against the world.
Well, in how are people going to trust me to represent them? So the PR endeavor that myself and with help from my brother have created is one of inclusivity, right? So we want to love and nurture our friends while we are elevating their voices and trying to allow larger audiences to exposure to them. So how are they supposed to trust us to be advocates for them if we are also being champions of people, you know, with problematic language and behaviors, you know? And that's not to say that I'm a perfect person. I have plenty of blind spots, right? You know, the truth of the matter is, like, I'm a middle-aged cis white male in the US Midwest. So yeah, I have tons of blind spots, but if somebody challenges me on something that I'm thinking or talking about, or not saying in the right way, or not using the right pronouns, or you know, whatever it is, I want to present myself as somebody that they can have that conversation with. Don't be so stubborn that you know everything to not be willing to have people express what their experience has been to you. Because what's the worst thing that could happen? You could learn something. You could not be right. I'd rather not be right yesterday and be more a more understanding, empathetic, caring person in my community tomorrow than force myself into a position where I believe I'm right all the time.
With everything that has happened politically and in regards to the Me Too movement specifically, you know, with so many members of bands being outed, either publicly or through our Whisper network or, you know, whatever, people are starting to understand that they do have value and that other people around them also have value. And I think people are slowly demanding more from the bands, which is what they should have demanded in the first place, which is just common respect and decency. You know, don't trash your venue. Don't be shitty to your fans. Don't try and take 18-year-old girls into the van when you're, you know, 3 times older than they are, 2 times older. But I feel like, you know, your mentality is starting to kind of become more of a commonplace, and hopefully will continue to expand, because again, as we said, this is a community, this is a scene. If no one's going to change this unless we change it, you know, the old guards step down or die off. And I think with them is going to have this new wave.
The other thing that we talk about is, you know, we're all works in progress. You don't have to be the same person you were 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And no one is born with all the knowledge and insight about this stuff. We're all constantly learning. And
in the learning process, we all mess up. We don't do
exactly
everything we're supposed to do instantaneously. We need a couple go arounds before we pick up on some of the things that other people are throwing down.
Totally. I mean, I don't feel the exact same way I did about some stuff relating to the culture of this that I did a year ago, you know, because I've learned more and seen different ways to handle things. And as long as we're all at least attempting to move in the right direction, then, you know, we should all be we should all be on the same page. But there are those holdouts who are still kind of stuck in, you know, well, this is the way it's always been, and I'm not going to change, so fuck you.
That to me becomes a question of accountability. If you've done something terrible and it becomes part of a discussion, and you know deep down that you've done that, I feel like the discussion goes a whole lot better for everyone. For the people that you victimized or, you know, marginalized, that pain isn't going to sting the same way if you're willing to be accountable for your own actions, right?
Exactly.
As the, you know, the Me Too movement has happened, like there have been people that have come out and been accountable. Like in the punk scene, there have been people that have come out and been accountable for their actions and been like, yeah, I was a piece of shit. Like I'm going to recuse myself from this scene while I go and get therapy and work on my shit because I was terrible. Right. And I mean, I feel like that's something that I could do too. Not to say that I like victimize people because I was in a place of power, but there have been times when I haven't treated people the way that I wanted to be treated. And so it's my responsibility now as like an adult, like citizen of the world to either apologize to those people for the things that I've done terrible to them when I recognize that I've done terrible things to them. Or it's time for me to step back from a position where I'm collecting people's money and I'm bringing them into spaces with me. Like, if I can't trust myself to do the right thing, then I don't deserve that kind of a platform. Especially in artistic circles, there's going to be narcissistic people that use that position of power to victimize people. That's not going away. You know, it's 2021. I've been going to punk shows since 1991. There hasn't been a decade or a time where I haven't seen those sort of dynamics at play, right? But do I want to support those people with my time, attention, dollars, clicks? I'm at the point now where it's a non-starter for me. In more cases than not, multiple people come out and say this person has victimized me. You know, if one person or 5 or 10 or 20 come out and say, you know, I've been victimized by this person, chances are, like, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So when I see Kanye West, like, bringing Marilyn Manson to his Sunday service, like, Kanye West is not somebody I'm going to support with my dollars anymore. And I'm certainly not going to support Marilyn Manson with my income.
From two people who have worked or currently work on PR and websites and zines and everything, this is a beast that will never be full. So if you're kicking this band to the curb, there's 19 other bands chomping at the bit to be your new favorite thing that sounds very similar to this band that you could just throw right into its place. I mean, and that's just talking about, you know, stuff on a national scene. There's a whole international world that I feel like as Americans, we don't really have that much access to, like, unless you really work for it. I mean, I'm very lucky that for Bad Copy, we've been getting submissions from other countries over the last year, like a lot of them. And it's really cool to get stuff from Brazil because I have no connection in the Brazilian scene. People get very stuck in their ways. And as I know I do, I listen to the same like 3 songs over and over again so many times.
It's all Bo Burnham songs.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much just the inside soundtrack. That's the only thing I've listened to all year. But there's so many different bands that are out there, and people, you know, you really sometimes do need to get that like little bit of extra push. There are so many small bands ready to make it big. There are so many talented people out there who don't have their share of the spotlight because some of these giant, abusive, manipulative, predatory assholes are hogging it all.
One band that I worked with earlier this year is kind of a small, like, unknown local band from New Jersey. And they spent the entirety of pandemic lockdown doing these video sort of concert series raising money for food banks in the community, in their community. In this particular band, all of them have day jobs. They're not professional musicians. They maybe have a fan base of 1,000 people, and they were doing such fun, engaging things within their community that they raised $20,000 over the course of the COVID lockdown. They raised $10,000 for their local food bank, and they raised $10,000 for a pediatric wheelchair foundation. So this particular band is called Super Mutt. They're from New Jersey. And, that's how they chose to use their time, talents, access to an audience was to do these positive things. As somebody that continues to write occasionally and spends a lot of time promoting bands, like that's the kind of band that I want to be in the orbit of. So we can choose whose orbit we're in, and we can choose who's in our orbit. And I want to be in orbit of people that are raising money for organizations that challenge human rights in Equatorial Guinea. That are working with sex workers and addicts in the Northwest, like Softkill is doing, that is raising money to help people with harm reduction with regards to suicidal ideation. That's the kind of people that I want to surround myself with, is people that care about the people that are around them. There's a time and a place for this kind of fuck you, burn the world down, I'm getting drunk sort of thing. And you know what? I've known and seen a lot of those bands over the course of years. And it's funny because when you get to know those people, that is their on-stage persona. They're not nihilistic people. That's part of the act. That's part of the catharsis that they're presenting on stage, right? And when you do happen to deal with people that are really like that, like they're not fun people to be around.
When you have punk or some of these more explorative underground genres, you're pretty much free to roam when it comes to lyrical and musical content. You can have a song about, fuck the world, let's, go party. And then you can have another song about taking care of the person right next to you. It is such a catharsis to go to some of these shows, to, run around and slam into people. I don't want to do that anymore. I'm too old for that. You break my bones. But, running around, jumping on top of each other, just screaming at the top of your lungs. That's always really great and fun. But at a certain point, I feel like as so many people in bands age, I mean, there is kind of like a rolling changeover where, the young age, it comes into that. You've got a lot of energy. You've got a lot of like, FTW, we're done with this, the nihilism, the world is bullshit. And then they start to age, and then their lyrical and musical content changes to something a little bit more substantial, I guess, to adults maybe, or maybe more action forward. And then you see some of these people that have taken this pure, raw, nihilistic energy and then have channeled it into things like you have mentioned, with these different projects, because everyone who writes these type of things usually has some sort of passion and drive behind it, and they can just shift the focus into something else. It doesn't mean that you've changed yourself completely as a band or a person. It just means that, as we talked about, you're growing up and you're seeing the world through other people's eyes. Your priorities are no longer getting out of this town. You've got different priorities now, and you're going to write about different things, and you're going to sing about different things.
Well, let's destroy the right things, right? Let's burn the right things down. Part of the challenge is like, okay, am I going to spend all my time trying to burn down this local comedian that said these problematic things when there are systems in place that are so much more damaging than this? Like, no, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going after this person, right? I'm going to be going out there trying to educate myself and do the right things with regards to voting, with regards to where I put my volunteer activities and actions and stuff. Like, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is like, let's not destroy and burn down each other. Like, let's destroy and burn down the things that need to be destroyed and burned down. And there's plenty of them out there. Let's put our time and attention and targets on the right thing.
Have you had any instances of bands approaching you for either PR work or in the past with like articles and stuff, or, been pitched articles where you've had to say flat out, like, I don't feel comfortable working with this band or doing this because of, XYZ?
I have. There have been at least 3 different instances in the last 9 years that I've been doing PR where I've had to say, this is not something that I can do. The first one was with the band that approached me. I knew some members of the band. The person that approached me, I didn't know well. I come to find out later, this person had an extensive record with regards to domestic violence against people that he was dating. So obviously that was not something that I was going to do. But then there are also times where you're like, okay, like this is more of a gray area. So there was another band that actually their label approached me and said, will you represent this band? Well, members of that band were in another band that had been called out in the international music media for the front man behind that endeavor having done having victimized somebody. So these guys aren't the guys who are being called out. This is not the project that's being called out, but how am I going to treat this, right? Neither the band or I felt comfortable dealing with each other based on that and other circumstances. There was a musician that approached me with a video that she wanted some PR help and exposure on. And I took a look at the video and I felt like it was problematic for LGBTQ communities, the content of this video. And so I asked this particular artist, I said, have you shown this to your friends that are LGBTQ? And she said, no. And I said, will you do that? And she was kind of like, well, no, it's art. I'm not willing to compromise my art, which puts red flags up for me. Like, if you're not willing to ask your friends from that community what their feelings are about it, then you don't want to have that discussion because you know that there's something that's amiss with it. I sent that to people that I trusted, friends of mine from the LGBTQ community, sent it to a friend of mine who is trans, sent it to a friend of mine who is gay, sent it to a friend of mine who is queer, and said, how do you feel about the message that this portrays? And all 3 of them came back to me and said, well, it's not that bad, but it's problematic in these ways. And that was enough for me to be like, okay, if my spidey senses are tingling, that this is not something that I should be helping to put out into the public purview, then this is not something that I'm willing to do. It's not fun to tell somebody that you have respect for under other circumstances, right? So in that last instance, that was somebody that I'd worked with previously.
I wonder how much of this is also a music only thing where, like if you're a tattoo artist, are you going to tattoo a swastika on someone if you're anti-racist? Or are you going to work for a company that has like a Confederate flag, on the front of their building? And, I wonder how much of it is like, why is this sort of specific to music that musicians can't make those choices to not work with abusers because it'll affect their paycheck, but other people can?
If you think about other ecosystems where people are really passionate fans, right? So like sports, are you going to support a coach that is using racist language? Are you going to continue to support the coach for that season? If you're a NASCAR fan, and somebody is wearing a Confederate flag thing or something, and this happens in other genres of music too. I don't think it's exclusive to punk rock where these conversations are happening. I mean, we just saw this R. Kelly thing happen for the last 2 decades, and people had to make some decisions about whether they were going to be R. Kelly fans or not, right? This is just kind of part of the natural cycle of being a human being, is like, what kind of human being do you want to be? What kinds of things are you willing to tolerate and not tolerate? And then what are you willing to support with your time and attention? And what are you willing to sort of do for $1, right?
What you put your time and your attention into is part of yourself. Who you spend your time with becomes part of you to a certain aspect. It's not like, it's automatic, But if you are, let's say the sports fan that supports these certain types of things, and the more you surround yourself by kind of this slippery slope of these people or this mentality doesn't really fit with your moral compass, eventually your moral compass changes. That's just how human nature works. So if it's the opposite, if you want to have a specific life, you want to have specific people in it, you want to be as open and understanding, I don't know that staying true to some of these more worn out ideas that some of these bands or comedians or whoever it is really going to keep you, it's going to get you in a position where you're able to grow as a human. You're going to basically be stuck. And unfortunately, from what we've seen in the punk scene, or at least the pop punk scene, it is like 50-year-old men who are 17-year-old children, because their point of view on things has never changed. Their scope of music has never changed. They listen to the same bands, sing about the same shit. Just discard some of this garbage and let this bullshit go in your life and find other bands. I mean, every time you envelop yourself in something new, I mean, just the act of discovering, and it's never easy to discover new music, and it's not like always enjoyable. There are times, and I'll admit this as somebody who runs a music website, where if someone asks me to review their album, it's like the last thing that I want to do is to sit down to an album that I've never heard of, completely new, when I can listen to the same 6 bands that I've been listening to for the past 17 weeks or whatever. It's a foreign experience. But like sometimes when you're driving around or however you ingest new music, I like to drive, while you're listening to it, you get new ideas, not just about music, but about stuff in general. And the lyrics hit you in certain ways and they remind you of things that, I mean, it's a very personal experience to me. And like, I'm pretty sure that every song I've ever liked is written directly about something that I've dealt with personally in my life. I don't know how they figured these things out. I mean, if we're stuck with the same mentality, with the same bands, even if they're just rebirths of this same like 5 bands that we've had in whatever genre, we're never going to grow and learn. And that's, I think, what we're seeing with so many different, I mean, the genres are always colliding, they're always changing, they're always meshing and moving away from each other. But I feel like we're at that point, especially in the last 5 years, where we've seen so many different types of bands allowed in what's considered punk, that it's really opening up the scope of what this genre could actually mean. So it's not just cis white dudes who are angry at the world. I mean, it hasn't been that.
Or at the girl that broke their heart, right?
Right, exactly. Or the pop punk. Well, let's go back to pop punk.
Right. Or emo.
But, the more people that have a voice in this genre, or in any genre, or in any part of the world in general, politics or anything, the more well-rounded we're all going to be as a collective group. We can't have the same one type of person doing all the explaining, mansplaining, whatever it would be for all of us, because they don't represent all of us. So get 10 people up there, get 25 voices up there, because then you're going to have an actual representation of what the dynamic of this culture really is.
One of the things that I realized as a result of a personal romantic relationship that I was in, I am a huge fan as sort of a Gen X product of the 80s of, John Hughes movies and Cameron Crowe movies. And one of the things that my romantic partner sort of challenged me on was, she was like, oh, okay, so you think every girl that you're romantically involved with is your manic pixie dream girl, right? And I was like, and so I had to really think about that. Like, okay, like how has being a fan of these movies colored my perception of who my romantic partners are going to be, or what those relationships should look like. So I just think as you become an adult, as you're ingesting that art, whether it's music or comedy or movies, or at some point you have to sort of step back and say, okay, like what has this indoctrinated in me that may not necessarily be the right thing for me to adopt as like a hard, fast black and white belief. That maybe doesn't go along the theme of the podcast, but I think challenging these perceptions that we're bringing into our minds and our hearts as fans of music, I think those internal conversations have to be happening too, right? Okay, what am I going to do now that X, Y, and Z band has been called out by 5 different people for victimizing them? It's like, okay, what is this band really talking about, and how seriously am I going to take that, and how am I going to sort of color my worldview with what I'm putting into my ears too, right? And this isn't a conversation that I came up with. I remember Jessica Hopper having this conversation, in the music press, decades ago, with regards to like emo and indie bands, like kind of using their female paramours as kind of this target of disdain. How seriously are we going to take this stuff as human beings? And then are we going to use the fact that we're fans of pop punk to justify the fact that we have kind of these misogynistic worldviews? And it all just comes with age, I think. An important part of that is like who you surround yourself with. So if I'm an addict, like I'm trying to change my life, I'm not going to surround myself with addicts. I'm going to go to a treatment facility and then move into a sober house, or, do whatever my program is. And part of that is distancing yourself from situations that don't work.
To help yourself as a single person.
Not to congratulate myself for sort of pivoting from writing into this PR thing that I've been doing, but like that was part of it. Like, who do I want to surround myself with, and what kind of time do I want to spend on people, and how important should it be to me that those are the right people to spend time on, not the wrong people? Now that we know that somebody's done something, like, are we going to let them continue to get away with it? Are we going to let them continue to use their power dynamic to, and their influence to take advantage of people? Or are we going to be like, no, it's not cool, and it's not something that I'm going to support? And I think we're seeing more instances where people are calling the venues and being like, listen, this band did this in this other city. Let's not have them here. If you've done something fucked up in Fargo, North Dakota, and you get to Montana, Bozeman, Montana, and they've heard about it, you're going to have to be accountable for it.
All people are asking for that are supposedly, the ones who are imbibe cancel culture mentality, they're asking for people to be held accountable. And until they are accountable for their actions, they need to step off their platform. Everyone is responsible for the way that they act in regards to other people. We really need to understand that whole comment of, if you see someone in the pit, pick them up, that really should be the mentality. If you see someone fall in the pit, you shouldn't try and rape them.
Well, and it's a ripple effect too. So like, you're not just affecting the individual that you're victimizing. One of the things that has been really powerful about what I've been watching on other episodes of the Enough podcast is people talking about the lasting effects of the abuse, that they've had PTSD. When you have an individual that's dealing with PTSD or anxiety or whatever the result of some sort of, horrific trauma, that doesn't just affect those people in a vacuum. That's affecting people that have relationships with them. That's affecting their families. That's affecting the way that they interact in their workplace. That's affecting the way that they interact with their spouses or partners or children. To kind of play it off like it's not a big deal doesn't make sense to me.
But on the opposite side, trying to spin this in a positive light, when you are there for somebody who has gone through something like this, they hold that close to their heart for the rest of the time, because they had no say in the trauma or the situation that they got put in. Those things are affecting them on a day-to-day basis. They are seeping into every single corner of their life. And if you're there to say, I believe you, and I'm here for you. If you need anything, you let me know, or what can I do to help you, and just really be there to support them, that is a huge step in the right direction for them. I mean, you're basically extending a lifeline to a person who feels like they're completely alone in the dark. So while, we can't all right the ship instantaneously, you can always be there for people.
Well, that's a good point too, because it will change if you have somebody that you care about who's been through an experience like that. It changes you, and it changes the way that the world is colored to you and the lenses that you see it through. You're right. Like, what's going to happen as a result of this terrible thing? Well, there are terrible things that are going to happen that are going to have ripple effects, but there are going to be positive things that happen too. There's going to be people who interact with you who've never experienced dealing with somebody with trauma before. And now, if they experience somebody else who's been through that, they know how to best help them.
Enough is a podcast centering on abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like or subscribe and share with your friends. If you have been on the receiving end of harm from someone, be it artist, venue owner, audience member, or someone else, and would like to share your story on a future episode, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com. All correspondences are kept confidential.